Well, thank you all very much indeed for joining us today. I mentioned a little bit earlier, but we'll certainly repeat again. My name is Will. I'm the Partnerships and Recruitment Manager for Opportunity China. I was also a teacher in China for several years. I was lucky enough to work as both a private language centre teacher and a public school teacher in the country. And today we're going to be taking a look at working life as a teacher in China. We'll be covering as much ground as we possibly can. We are going to be taking a look at what working life will be like as both a public school and a private language centre teacher. And we will be taking a little bit of a detailed look at the history of education in China to put that in context. But let's take a look first of all at what we're going to be covering. So we'll be looking first of all at the history of education in China in the context in which your role in a modern China, in a modern educational system fits in. We'll be taking a look at in-class challenges that you can expect to have living, working and teaching in China, be it at a private language centre or be it at a public school. We'll be taking a look at what the teacher expectation is going to be for each of you living, working and teaching in China, and why those expectations exist and why they're a little bit different to the expectations that are placed on native Chinese teachers. Before finally looking at cultural awareness in the workplace, looking at a few important points to bear in mind and to remember when living and working in China, with a few important do's and don'ts. It's important as well to remember that you can ask any questions you like just in our chat box. Do feel free to pop them down at any time. An Opportunity China coordinator will be happy to answer those in the chat box, and I will be stopping after each of these sections to take questions on the sections themselves as well. So we'll do our best to answer your questions as detailed as we can. Let's take a look first of all at education in China as a historical overview. Well, education in China is part of a backdrop of the world's oldest continuous civilization. China has over 5,000 years of civilization and history behind it. One of the most educationally dedicated cultures that has ever existed was in ancient China, and a lot of that thought and a lot of that spirit has carried forward into contemporary modern day China as well. A lot of this is very much down to one particular man and a particular ideology that the Chinese have followed for a very long time, and that man is Confucius and the philosophy of Confucianism. Now, Confucius believed that Chinese society was essentially held up by three great pillars: respect, morality, and education, with education being one of the most important aspects to what Confucius saw as being a harmonious society and a peaceful society. Education is at the very core of what is considered important in China. It's not just a part of life. It is a part of the social and moral fabric of the country. And with a growing middle class, this is very much why education and the improvement through education of children, of teenagers, and of adults is at the core of China's society, of China's culture, and indeed of China's economy. It's also at the core of a very ancient practice that's been followed through for thousands of years. But it is an ancient practice that has been somewhat disrupted in the modern China. And we'll just take a little bit of a look at some of the effects that education in the early People's Republic of China had. In 1949, after the Chinese Civil War, the formation of the People's Republic of China came about. 70 years old this October. After the formation of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao pursued a very aggressive agenda of changing the whole country from the root up. And as part of this, a huge amount of re-education was established, there was a tremendous amount of importance placed on people going back to the fields, learning the ways of the peasants, becoming the proletariat again. And creative subjects and arts were broadly seen as being wasteful and bourgeois under this new communist societal system. As part of this as well, there was a sense of isolation from the rest of the world. There was an emphasis that was placed on precise, skilled learning. Everybody was almost assigned a role. There was very little freedom to explore what you wanted to do when you grew up through education. It was pretty much decided for you by the party, and then that was taken down from school and taught to the students. Teachers had to teach a very precise and very narrow curriculum, and there was little to no room, even at the risk of death, to teach anything else. All of this, of course, culminated in the Cultural Revolution and the many terrors that happened for free-thinking academics during the 1960s in the People's Republic of China. And as an effect of the Cultural Revolution, also led to a tremendous amount of isolation to the country itself. Very few people went into China, and even fewer left China to go abroad. Therefore, there was a real stifling of academic thought during these early years of the People's Republic of China, and it led to a tremendous skills shortage when it came to these creative subjects and when it came to modes of communication that would help them communicate better with the outside world from the state of isolation that the People's Republic of China had found itself in. But then, of course, this has been followed by reform and the growth and rise of modern China. After Mao's death and after the ascension of Deng Xiaoping, China entered a stage, which it's still currently in, called reform and opening up. This began in 1979. As part of reform and opening up, there was again a roots-up change of the education system in China. Once again, investment was flowing in to the state education system. There was tremendous levels of reform, tremendous amounts of research done on fact-finding missions, and the growth and boom of cultural exchange between China and other countries in the world. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that China was now becoming an international and global-facing country, a country that had previously been isolated and closed itself off to the world, that had rejected things from the outside and feared them, was now looking out to the world, taking people in, welcoming people to their country, as well as exporting their thought and their ideas and their knowledge. And this was incredibly important because this reform and opening up led to a byproduct, which was the growth in the middle class of China and a return to investing in those traditional Chinese values, those Confucianist values, such as education, particularly for their children who now have a huge amount of choice that many of these parents and grandparents simply didn't have, because throughout their education during the Cultural Revolution and during the early years of the People's Republic of China, they were stifled and they were told they could only do one particular thing, pretty much from very early childhood. So this leads me quite nicely on to English in China. Now, as China has become a global-facing country, there's an importance for the citizens of that country to speak what China sees as the global language, which is English. In China, there are currently 300 million English language learners. That is 5 times the total population of the United Kingdom are currently learning English in China. In 2016, the Association of East Asian Nations adopted English as its official language, on top of trade with the United States, the United Kingdom, and the broadly Anglo-centric countries in the European Union when it comes to business languages. This was a massive step, as it's one of China's largest trading blocs. And it was realized quite quickly that there was going to be a need to educate this new global-facing China to speak a global business language, but not just to speak it, to master it, to be better at it, to be superior than other countries that would seemingly have a leg up because of the stifling of education during the 50s, 60s, and 70s in China. However, there are certain problems that still exist and still persist in China, not least the enormous population size of the country and the fact that China still has incredibly large class sizes when compared to countries like the United States and the United Kingdom to contain students in between 40 and 60 students. And rote learning in these large class sizes is largely still prevalent, partially again due to Confucianist thought, where there was a style of lecturing and students were taught to behave, to listen dutifully, and to study very hard. Whereas, of course, English is about participation and speaking to one another. Failings of individual attention and a lack of knowledge from an older generation who grew up in those times of stifling education has led to an enormous demand for all kinds of creative ways to help this younger generation in China master this important language skill. And there is an enormous demand in China through this for outward mobility, with more Chinese going abroad to study, more Chinese going abroad to work, more Chinese setting up companies in other countries as well. Now, before we move on, I'd just like to take any questions, if anyone has any questions at all, on the history and the modern day context of Chinese education. Okay, fantastic. Well, moving on. Again, if you have any questions, do feel free to pop them down and we will either answer them in the chat or we will answer them at the next juncture. So let's take a look at being in school in China and some of the challenges that you might expect to face within these schools. First of all, let's take a look at the types of schools in China. First of all, public schools. Public schools in China are where many of you on the Teach China graduate program are going to be working. Public schools in China can be rather homogenous. They're broadly laid out and designed in a quite modern way. The majority of public schools in China are very new. Most of them are built within the last 20 years, and a very, very, very large number of them have been entirely built within the last 10 to 5 years as well, particularly in new modern cities like Shenzhen. Within public schools, you'll have very large class sizes when compared to schools in the West, generally around 40 to 50 students in each class. They will sit in banks and rows as students in the West traditionally used to a very long time ago, and will each have their own desks. Now, students in China don't move between classrooms like we do in the United Kingdom. They stay in one class the whole day, and a teacher moves to each different one. Of course, having a very large class size in China can certainly be very challenging and is often seen as one of the biggest challenges for teachers when coming into a role. It's important at public schools to remember to be incredibly organised, to have PowerPoint presentations that are engaging, and also to make sure that your voice is very loud and you're a much larger presence than any of the students. It's also important to remember to teach students in banks and rows in which they're sitting. One of the most popular things for teaching in public schools is ensuring students get into teams. There are usually four long rows of chairs in each class, and having a row A, B, C, and D competing against one another is a really good way to encourage participation and get hands up in a class that's so large. Then, of course, there are private language centres. Private language centres are much smaller than public schools when it comes to class sizes. They average between 1 to 10 students in each class. Private language centres, however, even though they have small class sizes, can be as hard to manage as public schools. And a lot of this is due again to that historical context. In China, education and deference to a figure of authority, particularly within an environment of authority, was incredibly important and remains incredibly important in the culture. Therefore, 40 to 50 students within school time, where they know they have to sit down, where they know they have to behave, where there is continuous reassertion of where they are and what their responsibilities are through loudspeakers in the school, through daily exercises in the school, controlling a class there can be quite easy, even with 40 students, compared to controlling a class of 3 students who are coming to an additional class after school, after they've gone home, after they have left that environment where they know they have to learn. It's a really good idea at these private language centres to have good incentives, whether these are sweets or candies or small toys or stickers. Incentives at private language centres for encouraging speaking is incredibly important. And these are just a couple of unique little challenges that you have for each of these schools. Of course, there are other types of schools that I don't believe many of you are going to be teaching in, such as universities and international schools, who have their own unique issues as well. But broadly speaking, the challenges in the classroom can be narrowed down to excitement, and sometimes a little bit too much. This is particularly true of private language centres, but can also be true of public schools as well. Especially during foreign teachers' classes. A foreign teachers' class can seem sometimes a little bit like a treat for the students at a public school in China. They can get a little bit too excited, they can jump around a little bit too much, especially if they're very young. So ensuring in your first lesson that you ever teach them that you lay down the responsibilities that they are going to have in their class, that they need to sit, they need to listen to you, and they need to only speak when they are told or encouraged to speak. Of course, your roles, you are going to be encouraging oral English, but you do need to create a set of rules and have that laid out very early on in a public school to ensure you are not going to fall into a state of chaos. And again, this needs to be done at private language centres as well. Of course, be kind, be nice, be gentle, but also be authoritative when you first meet them. It's far too easy with their smiling, bright, loving faces when you first see them to fall into a trap of almost being their friend. Remember, you're their teacher first. Among younger years, there can be a struggle to distinguish between work and play in active lessons. So again, for both public schools and private language centres, a lot of the lesson plans that you're going to have are going to be very largely based on game activities, on things that they're going to find fun. And because of that kind of lecture rote style of learning they're used to in China, it can be quite hard for them to distinguish between something being play and something being work, if it's something that they've previously not associated with being in school for. Again, it's important to lay down what the responsibilities are in the first lesson, but also to reinforce it in every single subsequent lesson. Begin each of your lessons with a set of rules, get them to repeat those set of rules back to you, and get them to demonstrate that they understand these rules. Whether it's sitting up straight and behaving, whether it's don't speak until the teacher speaks. Again, encouraging and incentivizing these each lesson is incredibly important. Shyness and insulation. Very often, Chinese students can be quite insular. This almost seems like a reverse problem to the previous two, but it is as problematic as your role is going to be both keeping order, but also ensuring students are going to be answering questions and participating. Ensure you do this in a very orderly fashion. One really good way of doing it will be giving small chips, like betting chips, to each student in your class. If you have a very large class, maybe only giving one each. If you have a very small class in a private language centre, giving multiple ones. And ensuring that the students have to get rid of their little chip before the end of each class. They give you their chip after they answer a question. So this adds a sense of competition that students in China will have, but also encourages them to speak a little bit more as well. There are also wildly varying expectations in the classroom that you will see. There are going to be students who will, in a class of 40, who will be excelling and have enormous expectations placed on them by their parents and by other teachers. And you'll have students who will be sat at the back who will seemingly never do anything. It's very important that you remember to focus attention, be deterministic, and again, try to make sure everyone speaks and no one dominates a class more than the teacher does. Bringing students out of hiding for this is incredibly important as a concept as well. Trying to speak with students who are struggling, maybe during lunch times or during break times, and encouraging them a little bit more is incredibly important. If you're working in a private language centre, speaking with their parents and with the students just after the classes as well is another great way of addressing challenges such as this. But most importantly, you've got to remember, be your strongest, be your boldest, and be your loudest when you are in these classes. Because especially with public schools, you are going to need to project right to the back of the room. You are going to need to hold the attention of absolutely all of them. And with the younger ones, you are again going to need to be bold and going to need to be memorable with what you are teaching. Parents are very much also a challenge that some people are sometimes a little bit scared of coming across. This is particularly true of language centres. Those of you who are going to be working in language centres, you're going to be speaking with parents pretty much after every single lesson you have and giving feedback on each individual student. In China, parents generally have very high expectations of their children and can put a huge amount of pressure on them and can be quite strict and severe with them at times as well. They'll sometimes have contradictory or confusing requirements where one week they'll ask you to do one thing with the students, another week they'll ask you to do another thing. The most important thing to remember is to follow the curriculum that you have to ensure you show face to the parents. It's very often not advisable to be, even if a child has been incredibly naughty, to go in quite so straight in China with the parents about that, especially not if you're speaking with the parents in a group of others. If you do need to criticise the behaviour of a child, it's usually better to take a parent off, maybe into a corner away from the other parents, and speak to them a little bit more privately about matters that might make them lose face in front of other parents at that time. Does anyone have any questions on challenges in the classroom in China? Okay, again, any questions at all that come up, do feel free to pop them in there and we'll address them as soon as we can. So foreign teachers in China and the expectations that are placed on you as a teacher in China. First of all, it's important to take a look at why are we here? Why are we in the country? Why are we in China? We're there to lift the standard of English to keep up with the academic progress that has been made in China in other areas that suffered in English language learning because of those before mentioned points. There is also a perceived shortfall in speaking and communication among students in China. Again, it's a lot harder for students in China to sit in a class of 40 and learn and practice to communicate speaking in a very different language than it is for them to sit and memorize Chinese characters, or for them to sit and memorize mathematical formulas or scientific formulas. So there's an enormous pressure to keep up with those other areas of education in China that the country is currently excelling in. Among older students, to improve confidence and communication skills. So among students who are, say, in middle school or in high school, a huge amount of the emphasis that's placed on why you're there is to improve these aspects. Usually students in middle and high school in China, around that sort of 12 age upwards, have a very strong vocabulary, but have a very weak sense of communication. So to encourage them to speak more, to encourage them to do group work more in their classes, and to encourage them to talk in class in front of people is incredibly important. Among younger students, there's a lot more of an emphasis placed on giving a very strong foundation to their education, from hearing a native speaker express things in English. So there is much more vocabulary teaching for younger students, reading teaching, stories, games and songs. A lot more of an emphasis is placed for younger students around the immersive environment of being taught English by someone from a native country. So that's a little less precise and a little broader, but a huge amount of it is building that foundation, because of course they are still, from the age of say 3 to 12, at that very sponge-like part of their life where they are absorbing information continuously. For older teens and adults, the purpose of foreign teachers in China is a little more complex. It's usually to teach more complex methods of communication and business English, to learn about the nuances that there are going to be, to practice certain scenarios that they might have or they might encounter, to help them prepare for things like IELTS tests or TOEFL tests. Or TOEFL tests as well. These are generally the purposes for native teachers for those older teens and adults. Now, being a foreign teacher in China, there are certain personality expectations that are going to weigh on you when you arrive. One of the biggest is being engaging, high energy and fun. Your role is going to be creating a memorable environment for your students. Your classes are going to be something special for the students each week, something that needs to be very different to those lecture rote style classes that they will have day to day. You need to be able to hold the attention of an individual or a large group and everything in between that. You need to be deterministic with your learning. You need to have attention to detail to see what the individual needs of each of your students are, and to be able to present in a clear, loud and meaningful way to a large class as well. You need to be able to accurately work with teaching materials for students. So you need to be able to understand and adapt any teaching materials that are given to you. So you want to be someone who's adaptable, somebody who's flexible, someone who's not afraid to tailor something that they've been given to their own needs. And very importantly, you need to be able to display patience and care with students. Some students are going to be much slower, and it's important to remember why this might be and why they might be struggling. There are also going to be students who are going to be disruptions, and not losing your cool in classes is incredibly important, because as soon as you lose your temper, you lose the class. So remembering to have patience, remembering to take care of what you say and to think before you say things is incredibly important as well. There are, of course, also practical expectations for foreign teachers in China. Lessons will need to be planned well in advance and checked with colleagues. For those of you who are going to be working in private language centres, they're going to be very plug and play, the kinds of curriculums and lesson plans that you're going to have. But adapting everything and checking with colleagues in your office is a really, really important thing. With public schools, again, you'll largely be working to a curriculum that's going to be quite flexible. But again, checking your lessons with your colleagues, checking the lessons with the Chinese English teachers if you're doing review sessions on the classes that they've just done, paying attention and actually attending some of the Chinese English classes as well to see what the students are learning and get an idea of who's behaving and who's doing well, who's not doing so well is incredibly important too. You've got to ensure that student progress is logged and information on individual students is suitably organised in order to give good feedback both to the students and to the parents. And you also need to be ready to adapt to last-minute changes. This is a massive thing in China. China, absolutely everything is fluid, life is fluid the whole time in the country, and things can change in a flash. So if you're working in a private language centre, you may have a student that comes in to do a catch-up class, and they may only let you know 20 minutes before the class starts, but the parent really wants to do it, so be flexible, find the best possible way of doing this class. You might not have an hour to plan a class, but make the most of the situation that you are in to do as good a job as you possibly can. Rejecting and turning these opportunities down generally isn't such a good idea. Again, the same if you are working in a private language centre, you might have a demo class very quickly. So preparing and having as Boris Johnson would say, an oven-ready demo class for your students to have. So any student that comes into your class, whether you're told about it 10 minutes or 10 days before the demo is supposed to happen, you've got a well-practiced, well-rehearsed demo class ready to go for them. You've also got to make sure you put the interests of the school and workplace harmony as a priority above many other things. In China, relationships and face are incredibly important concepts. So you need to be someone who puts the group above yourself, someone who puts the interests of the school above yourself, and someone who's going to be flexible and ready to go with things and keep a harmony in the office. We'll be going into a little more detail on that in a moment. Does anyone have any questions on expectations of teachers in China? Okay, again, as always, if you do have any questions whatsoever, please do pop those in the chat box. So we're going to go on to our final section, which is cultural awareness at work. We're going to take a look, first of all, at workplace etiquette, what you should be doing whilst you're at work. This is very directly associated with cross-cultural understanding, and there's going to be a lot of crossover between this and several of the things that we're going to look at tomorrow when we speak more broadly about Chinese culture in the webinar tomorrow. But as part of this, flexibility and adaptability are very greatly admired among individuals in the workplace. In China, you will often see individuals falling over themselves to help their colleagues. There is a tremendous sense of camaraderie, a tremendous sense of loyalty to groups in China, and this is broadly because culturally in China it is a less self-focused society and culture and considerably more group-focused and holistic. It's a more homogenous society in terms of the manner in which people think. It's a country where they broadly see the group as being a single entity that moves together, and individuals going off in their own way is quite largely frowned upon. So remembering these aspects when it comes to working in China and when it comes to understanding some of the behaviour that you may see around you is going to be important. It's also important to remember that hierarchy and authority in China are incredibly important, and ensuring that appropriate levels of language, deference, and demeanour are displayed when speaking with those in a position of authority in the workplace. And also ensuring whether you're working with a figure of authority, a colleague, or someone at any level in an organisation, dealing with issues sensitively, ensuring that you're saving another person's face, ensuring that you're keeping your face in the path of doing so. And also remembering that relationships at work are absolutely key. Keeping strong relationships with each individual will only make your status stronger and only mean that everyone will be more keen to help you. Again, in China, one of the wonderful things about the country is just how ready people are to help you because of that cultural sense of a single whole. But remember as well, as soon as you break that whole, there is a level of trust that can also be broken with that as well. So when it comes to things like resolving issues in China, always ensure that discretion and privacy are kept. Never bring up an issue, never bring up a grievance that you might have in front of other co-workers. It doesn't matter who you're speaking with, it doesn't reflect well because you are seen as losing someone else's face and you actually losing your self-face as well because you are seen as purposefully stripping them of theirs. You need to be careful not to appear confrontational. Again, harmony is something that's very important in China, and keeping a harmonious environment, again, showing face, showing that you are reasoned when dealing with the situation is incredibly important. So stopping, thinking and breathing before saying anything are very important aspects. Remember to remain respectful and diplomatic in your tone as well when resolving issues. I often find it's a very good way of resolving an issue or lodging a complaint is to say something that you're really enjoying in your place of work and thank an authority figure for that before bringing up something that maybe is a little bit of a problem for you, and finally finishing on saying how much you appreciate the opportunity that you've been given. Praise is a thing in China that's very important, and ensuring that you maintain and create good relationships and harmony and keep a good feeling among those who you're communicating with is incredibly important. Make sure you do your research as well before lodging any complaint. Very often in China, things can change. Multiple people can be involved in a decision-making process, and it's not always necessarily clear who might be at fault for a mistake. So make sure you work that out. I've had several embarrassing incidents when I was in China where I didn't think through something before making a complaint about something someone had done, and ended up finding out that it was actually my fault in the first place. So making sure you research absolutely everything very, very carefully and find out exactly what went wrong before making any kind of complaint. And to retain relationships, ensure face is saved from all sides. Make sure no one feels humiliated. Make sure no one feels like they've been laughed at or told that they're bad or wrong as well. In China, things can be extra sensitive when it comes to things like that. Does anyone have any questions on cultural awareness in China, or any questions related to resolving those issues that you might come across in China? Okay, brilliant. Well, tomorrow we are going to be looking at life outside work, Chinese culture and immersion. This is a really, really useful webinar, and I really heavily recommend that you all attend this. We're going to be looking at key core cultural concepts of face, mianzi, networks, guanxi. We'll be looking at the importance of gathering, of food, of family, of how to conduct yourself at best in public in China. We're going to be taking a look at aspects of language as well. We are going to be taking a look at what day-to-day life is going to look like outside of the class. This is one of our most comprehensive sessions, so we're going to be looking at a whole range of things. We'll be looking at things like security, things like taboos in China, massive do's and don'ts, and we are also going to be looking at things like the Great Firewall, VPNs as well. Now, before we finish today, does anyone have any final questions? Remember, tomorrow the webinar is going to be on again at 6 p.m. Okay, well, if anyone does have any questions or anything pops into your head, please do feel free to email your Opportunity China coordinator. They'll be more than happy to get back to you very, very swiftly. Oh, here we go. Sorry, we do have a couple. So what VPN do you recommend? And then Luke says Express. Yes, we do recommend VPN Express. VPN Express is a little more expensive than some of the others, such as Viper or Nord. But VPN Express updates on a very, very regular basis. At the moment in China, there is a little more of a crackdown on VPN servers, so it's a little bit harder and it takes a little bit longer for them to load up. VPN Express, like I say, has very, very regular updates that mean that it is the most reliable source, and at times where things are sensitive, VPNs can become a little bit slower, so we do recommend VPN Express as being the most reliable VPN. Does anyone else have any other questions just at the moment? Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for joining us again today. And as I mentioned, please do feel free to put any questions that you have to your Opportunity China coordinator. Thank you very much for joining us once again. I hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow for our webinar on culture in China, life outside China, and the core cultural concepts that go along with that. Thank you very much once again, and goodbye.